It's a great pleasure for me to join you here this morning in this very historic building, a building and a hall which has seen almost the entire evolution of Icelandic society from being, when it was built more than 100 years ago, a nation of poor farmers and fishermen, truly one of the poorest in Europe. Reykjavik at that time, little more than a village with mud streets and timber bulk iron houses. But this was the greatest assembly hall for that poor town, and a nation which numbered less than 100,000 people and was still dependent on the Danes for all major decisions. I wouldn't call it a colonial power, but to some extent, that was the position. And then with foresight, despite being poor, they built this magnificent hall. Think about it. Over 100 years ago, poor farmers and fishermen building this extraordinary hall. Not just to show movies, but to listen to poets read their new work. Writers like Halldór Laxness, who later became a Nobel Prize winner, reading essays and making challenging speeches to the population. And the people of the town gathering here for discussions and rallies and protests. Don't let's forget that. I even, in my younger years, organized some protest meetings in this hall. Yes. So, it's a great pleasure for me to join you here this morning, not just because of the exciting subject matter of your discussions and dialogue, but also because this building somehow reminds all of us in Iceland that despite the ups and downs over the times and the centuries, we are above all a nation of storytellers. That's really what has kept us going, being a nation of storytellers. That was what allowed the poor farmers in the turf houses and the fishermen, even in the open boats, survive the forces of nature and the poverty, that they told great stories. And they were poets. It didn't matter how poor they were or what were the challenges and the hardships they faced, they could always turn everything into a text, a story, or a poem. I sometimes point out to foreign visitors who arrive here from other countries that it's a revealing evidence of how ingrained the respect for the storytellers and the poets is in this country. That as you walk around Reykjavik, you will find a number of statues of poets and writers, but you will not find any statue of a president. And I'm not complaining, but that's a fact. Why is it that other nations have statues of generals and military leaders and great heads of states, but this nation has statues of poets, writers and storytellers? And that's really what made us. When the independence campaign was being conducted from the middle of the 19th century, it was justified by reference to the old sagas. When the rest of Europe wrote in Latin and obeyed the Catholic Church, the Icelanders in the 11th and the 12th and the 13th century wrote in Icelandic. Stories of the Vikings and poets like the Eddas. And 800 years later, this literary heritage became the justification of our independence campaign. The primary reason for the Icelanders claiming independence was the excellence of the literary heritage. And why am I telling you this here this morning? Not just because it inspires me to come back to this hall, which somehow symbolizes the long journey of Iceland from being a poor nation of farmers and fishermen to to the nation where CCP is headquartered. The reason why I'm telling you this is when, in the early years of my presidency, too long ago to actually count here to this morning, in the final years of the last century, many of us were discussing and wondering, will we be able to place ourselves in this new world of information technology, gaming, virtual reality? How will we be able to transform this tradition of storytelling into this new world of technology? And I remember I attended a few conferences, not like this, but conferences. For example, one was in our National Theatre in the final years of the 20th century, facing this challenge. Can we really be players in this new world of gaming and virtual reality? And in one of my speeches, I argued that there were two reasons why we could indeed become competitive, be an interesting field for investors and foreign partners in this new area of storytelling, because that's basically what it is. You take away all the technology, it is in essence storytelling. And my argument was twofold. One was exactly this, that it was just a question of medium. In the early centuries, we wrote the stories of calfskin. Then we just told them and reported them by our voices, and the people traveling from one part of the country to another, and it then through the printing press in later times. But secondly, being a small society and somehow don't having the barriers between different sectors. If you are in a larger country, there is a tendency that painters simply mix with painters and actors simply mix with actors. And musicians mostly mix with musicians, and business people just mix with themselves. But here in Iceland, partly due to the smallness, but partly also due to the culture of the society, it is a melting pot of people coming together from many different areas and so easily picking on their friends and others to link up with them and contribute to the enterprise. And that is in addition linked to a fundamental aspect of our culture, which I hope we will maintain in the coming years, is that it is in essence the Icelandic society an exercise in trusting people. That's why I come here this morning without a horde of security guards. Why none of you has been checked when you came into this building. Because in essence, we are still in the second decade of the 21st century, a nation built on trusting people. Assuming that everybody who comes as a friend until proven otherwise. And therefore, people who are creating new companies, have new ideas, they pick on their friends, they bring them together. And then if it is a success and they think they might be journeying to a new enterprise, then they bring in the lawyers. Whereas in countries I'm not going to name, you bring in the lawyers in the very beginning. That's not a very promising approach. Because without the creativity and the ideas and the poetry of using this fascinating new medium, there will be no success. And when we were discussing this almost 20 years ago, when this new era was starting, there was still a question, is this analysis correct? The analysis which I have briefly outlined to you here this morning. But now we have a track record. Now we have an extraordinary number of successful companies that have been created by 2 or 3 or 4 or even 1 persons in this country, gradually picking their friends, expanding it, starting small, but within an extraordinarily short time, becoming a global player and being able to offer what they have produced in this melting pot to investors and partners in other countries. And I am not here this morning going to list these companies, this list of success, for two reasons. First of all, you should all know them. Secondly, I will get into trouble if I forget some. But it is a pretty impressive list. And then if you had visited, for example, CCP, I will mention that because I can look directly at the door and I will have been allowed to do that. If you had visited them in the very first years that they started operating in the fishing plant, the old fishing plant down by the old harbor, it would be a crazy idea that they would travel so far, so quickly as they've actually done. I also remember just a few years ago, after the financial crash and the banks collapsed, visiting some of the startup companies that were just beginning to test out the things in Iceland have now been sold to investors in other countries for an extraordinary amount of money. And it has been inspiring, having visited some of these companies in the months and the first year after the banks collapsed, to see that the optimism that I faced when I visited them in these turbulent times of the financial crisis has in fact been justified. And that is my final point here this morning to the international investors. That not only is Iceland a fascinating laboratory and a territory to explore the potential of partnership because of this centuries-old tradition of storytelling, and not only is it an interesting laboratory to examine and look for opportunities because of the creative processes of people from different fields coming together so quickly and so creatively, it is also a fascinating laboratory on the ground to look for new ideas because the financial crisis, the crash of the banks, tested the young generation of our countries beyond what perhaps any other generation of creative people in other countries has been tested. Because you faced two options. Either you left the country or you used your creative capabilities to do something new and to do something that would excel. And by and large, that is what the young generation of this country did. So they come into the second decade of the 21st century, hardened, inspired, more experienced, and wiser, after having been through this storm that is still affecting many countries in Europe and elsewhere. And that is why I hope today and tomorrow and the follow-up discussions, you will find it an interesting journey to explore the possibilities of partnership with the younger people of this country. Thank you.